Macron of France has been, Zelensky of Ukraine is going later in the week, but now it's Keir Starmer's turn, heading to the White House to see Donald Trump. How will he get on? Well, that's the question on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the studio. What a week! And it's only Wednesday. We've had a German election, we've had the French president in the White House, we've had an increase in defence spending here in the UK, and now, arguably, the big moment, the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is off to meet President Trump, and Chris Mason is travelling with him. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, hello, James. I am on quite a posh sofa, actually. It's got cushions and everything. At the airport, we're going to be leaving in a few hours and flying with the Prime Minister to Washington. So, just been doing the whole bag check-in stuff and boarding pass and all that malarkey. And yeah, we'll be setting off pretty soon.
And quite a lot might happen when you get there, I imagine. What a big trip.
It's extraordinary, really, I think. I mean, I've been on plenty of prime ministerial trips, including a few to the White House, but none before have felt quite as laden with both importance, with those huge questions, not least around Ukraine, but also the Middle East and Gaza and tariffs and trade, but then also and this sounds like I'm trivialising it, but I think the two things are connected. The unpredictable theatricality of a meeting with Donald Trump, of which we get a glimpse in public, and perhaps more so than often with other presidents because of President Trump's sort of penchant for the limelight. So, I think it could be pretty similar to what we saw with President Macron of France the other day, where us reporters will be invited into the Oval Office at the beginning of their meeting, and there'll be various remarks made, and we'll shout various questions, and who knows, frankly, what the president will say. I think we've got a reasonable idea of what the Prime Minister's likely to say. Then they'll go off and do their thing in private, with every possibility it's just as lively when the cameras are not there as it is when they are. And then there's a news conference afterwards where, the cameras and us lot roll up again and try and get called to ask a question, etc., etc. And we get some sense of perhaps where the president is, or at least where he is after that meeting. Because as we've seen in the last couple of days, just on the question of Ukraine, we've seen positions taken and then positions reversed out of, or others within the administration saying different things. So, it'll be fascinating.
So, the heart of this is obviously Keir Starmer desperately trying to remain a bridge between the United States on one hand and Europe on the other. And obviously, Chris, the challenge in doing that, or one of the many challenges, is what has happened in terms of American policy. It's not just necessarily the words of Donald Trump, but he has been calling President Zelensky of Ukraine a dictator. The United States has voted in the United Nations with Russia, North Korea and Belarus in refusing to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. President Trump has blamed Ukraine for being invaded by Russia. I mean, these are not minor differences that will be easy to paper over in public when questions are being thrown, especially if Donald Trump repeats any of those things with Keir Starmer right next to him. What does the Prime Minister do? How does he handle that?
It is extraordinary, isn't it, James, imagining the prep that the Prime Minister and his team have done around handling those moments, both publicly and privately. Yes, they talk about being this bridge between the US and Europe. There's a flip side to that imagery, isn't there? Because you think of a bridge as being this sort of linking this linking structure, but bridges also get walked all over, and so there's that kind of sense that you've got to be quite careful adopting that position. But absolutely. How on earth does the Prime Minister? Because alongside the vast political differences between the two men, temperamentally and in character terms, they couldn't be more different either. How does he handle that? Now, we saw President Macron the other day handle it in, I think, what was widely seen as a pretty good way in an awkward moment, including when he did have to publicly contradict the president in front of the cameras. Now, President Macron does the whole tactile thing in diplomacy pretty well, the world's longest handshake, which is a bit of a thing that he and President Trump have going on. Bit weird, but they do it every time. And it looks like Donald Trump's not letting go, but I can never quite work out what the precise dynamic is there. And he even did a bit of knee grabbing, didn't he? The
quite
president
a lot,
of France
Chris.
the other night.
There's quite a lot of touching.
Yeah, you see. Yeah, and now I like to limit my analysis to the broadly political rather than anything further, but I don't have Keir Starmer down as a sort of knee grabber in terms of his diplomatic toolkit. I might be proven wrong. Who knows what a meeting with Donald Trump in the White House might necessitate? But on the to tilt back towards the sort of more serious point here, how does he, in attempting, because they have been desperate to maintain this idea of a sort of kind of equidistance, that's my word, not theirs, but between Europe and the US, not choosing between. How do they try and maintain doing that, and also try to maintain using a language that is not provocative towards Washington and towards Donald Trump? Because the lesson they've taken is that if you're provocative towards him, he just ups the ante, he just goes higher or lower, depending on your perspective, in terms of the kind of insults that start flying. So how do you maintain that sort of diplomacy when the differences on some issues are, frankly, a million miles apart? And that's going to be fascinating to witness. And
also the other obvious thing to say, but I'm not sure it's said as often as perhaps it should be, this is not a relationship of equals. I mean, I think that's quite important here. The damage that Donald Trump can cause Keir Starmer is of an order of magnitude greater than any problem that Keir Starmer can ever pose to Donald Trump. Is that fair, Chris? Is that fair analysis?
I think that's entirely fair, and one where, as you rightly say, we ought to say that more often, because inevitably, when you see sort of two blokes on two chairs, there's a certain sense of symmetry there, but there's a wildly asymmetric relationship, isn't it? Of course it is, between the US and the UK, and particularly the political damage, potentially, that a US president can cause to a British Prime Minister. Now, I suppose in Keir Starmer's back pocket are opinion polls here in the UK that suggest almost regardless of your political belief, there is a significant majority of people in the UK who are pretty sceptical about Donald Trump's outlook and his means and ways of going about business. Of course, there are people who like him, but he is not broadly popular here. So there might be an element beyond party political allegiance of people in the UK sort of, to a degree at least, cheering a British Prime Minister on. But yeah, of course, his words, a president's words, and particularly Donald Trump's words really, really carry. And he would have the capacity, easily in a couple of sentences, planned or otherwise, to cause not just ripples, massive splashes in the British political debate. And all of that could happen, in front of us on camera in the next 24 hours.
But in terms of defence spending, we had this announcement from the Prime Minister yesterday. What's your take now, a day on? How's that been received? Bit of a debate about how much money it really is. What are people saying?
Politically, it's big. It's big because Labour has shredded a manifesto commitment around boosting international aid and instead done the opposite. They have not only put a time frame on getting to 2.5% of national income being spent on defence, but they put it earlier than many anticipated that they would, with 2027. There is a little wrinkle in the numbers, and it's worth pointing to that. You might have heard government figures talking about £13.4 billion extra by 2027 compared with now. That is true, but that assumes, if you just take that number in isolation, that the defence budget was not going to increase in the next couple of years, and it would have been doing that. So the number is actually smaller. It's around about 6 billion. But for those who advocate more money on defence, it has been broadly welcomed, with some suggesting that countries like the UK will have to go further and faster than they currently are, even given what the UK has said. But I think, in political terms, it is pretty significant, not least because of the heat that Labour are taking primarily from their own side, actually, around the decision to do what they've done with aid spending. That said, I think the argument would be even hotter had the spending come from domestic priorities instead, which would have been the alternative if you weren't going to put up taxes to pay for it.
Yes, and indeed at Prime Minister's questions, it came up a fair bit, the defence spending, and there was, at least at one or 2 points, suggestions that some people within the House of Commons don't think that this is anything like enough, given the threat posed by Russia and others, and the apparent now unreliability of the United States in providing this security guarantee running back to the Second World War.
Yeah, completely. So you have that debate very much up and running. I think there's a broader point here, James, which is worth sort of reflecting on, which is that I picked up for months, in fact years, at Westminster, a nervousness from some that across multiple parties, by the way, that the country, that we as a country had not had a big and long national conversation about spending money on defence. That people had sort of turned off a sense that defence was a priority because of that sort of sense of the post-Cold War peace dividend and money being spent elsewhere, schools, hospitals, welfare, etc. And that there would have to be a debate had and won on behalf of those who would want to see significant increases in defence spending happening over a sustained period of time. And the second element of the conversation yesterday, less newsworthy than the whole conversation about 2.5% because that's more imminent, but is the argument about getting to 3% in the next parliament, in other words, in the first half of the 2030s, because to do that would require very big choices. And that's not to say the choice on aid isn't significant, but it would require really big choices about trade-offs, about taxes, about borrowing. Taxes, of course, historically high, the tax burden overall, borrowing and debt very, very high as well. Plenty of people arguing that some public services are in need of further investment, even though the state is historically big. So that crunchy conversation about priorities beyond 2.5% is what I think the Prime Minister is really keen to get going. And I think in that sense, yesterday heralded the start of that process, which could rumble for the best part of the next 10 years, as well as the specifics of that 2.5% by 2027.
And I suppose, Chris, obviously, he's hoping that this plays well with the man he's about to go and meet, and not both the cut in aid budget to fund it, because that's something, as we were talking with Alex yesterday on Newscast, that's something that the United States has done and then some, but also because it's Donald Trump who's really, to be fair to him, for years been leading the charge and saying we contribute more than we should, in his view, the United States, to European defence, and you lot need to do more.
Yeah, I totally right about that point about both sides of the ledger. So both sides of the UK ledger on yesterday's argument are going to get a thumbs up in the White House, given what we've seen the Trump administration do as far as US aid is concerned, and then that long-standing argument going back to his first term around other Western allies, as he would see it, not pulling their weight as far as defence spending is concerned. So both elements of that are going to get a tick. Yes, there's nervousness from some about aid, real nervousness, anger from some about aid, but you won't find many of those voices in the contemporary White House.
No, Chris, thank you. Will you get a nap? Do you sleep on planes?
Well, I'm not very good at sleeping on planes. I'm very fortunate. I spend a lot of time on planes, but I've never really learnt the knack of sleeping sitting up. So, and anyway, on the way out, it'll be busy typing away and recording bits and bobs and all that kind of stuff.
Well, good luck with it, Chris. Good luck.
Cheers, James. Talk to you soon.
See you soon. Bye. Right, now to another huge issue, and one that, as we said at the start, never goes away, and that is climate change. But this time, it's not so much about what governments are doing. There's a report from the Climate Change Committee which advises the UK government, and it's more about what you and I should be doing, what newscasters should be doing to tackle climate change ourselves. Justin Rowlatt, the BBC's climate editor, is here with us to talk about that. Hi, Justin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Not at all. And Emma Pinchbeck, who is Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, and indeed a regular on Newscast. Hello, Emma.
Hello, sorry about that.
No, not at all. Not at all. Emma, can we just start, first of all, by looking at what this report actually is for in relationship to the government? You know, can you just explain the structure of it? It sounds like a really boring question to start with, but it sort of matters, doesn't it?
No, like one of my favourite questions. Let's talk about governance. Yeah, we're this statutory independent body, and we're set up to advise government on how they might deliver their net zero target. And our mandated job is to publish these carbon budgets, and we publish them about 12 or 13 years ahead. and they're for a period in the economy. And so this one is for 2028 to 2032. And what we do is we say we think this much carbon can be released in the economy in this time to keep us en route to delivering against net zero by 2050.
Which is a legal target.
And that, if they accept it, becomes a legal target. And then we're also required to show them that the target's feasible. So as part of that process, we publish this big report alongside the number, which talks about the changes in the economy that can get you to that number. But really importantly, ultimately, the government then decides what policies they actually want to adopt. And they could be quite different from the ones we've come up with. The important thing is the number.
But let's look then at some of those ideas, suggestions, as you're putting it, really, to the government about what policies they could adopt, Emma. So just to pick out some of those, and correct me if I'm wrong, 4 in 5 cars need to become electric and half of homes need to have heat pumps within the next 15 years. Is that right? And if so, is that not a pretty dramatic change to the way we live?
Yes, that is right. And the reason for that is that the thing that I've always liked about the carbon budget, speaking as someone that came from the private sector, is they set a long-term goal, which gives kind of industry clarity. And if you think about technology choices like your heating system or buying a car or building a new power station, it can take that long for your existing boiler to stop working. It takes us that long to, finance and build a new power plant. And so the idea of us is that we're taking a medium or long-term view about these changes. And yes, they seem big, but I would say we've over halved our emissions since 1990 already. And what we've done with those technologies is model rollouts we've seen in other countries. So what we're projecting for the UK is what's happened in Ireland, it's happened in Sweden and some other colder countries in the UK. And that, in combination with some other things we can see in the market, like the potential for cheap electricity and so on, means we're pretty confident that those technologies will take off. And for electric vehicles, for example, we think they're going to be cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles pretty soon. So people will buy them when they're coming to replace their car.
Just I want to bring Justin in, but before that, just really quickly to clarify, cheaper to buy in the immediate future or cheaper overall over the course of the lifetime of the vehicle?
Cheaper to buy in the immediate future. And if you have one already, like I have an electric vehicle, your electric vehicle is probably already cheaper to run. And the primary recommendation we're making to government today, when we are making recommendations, is that they find a way to make electricity cheaper. And then for both the heat pump and an electric vehicle, people that have them start saving money on their bills because they're more efficient technologies. And so we think the economics are really in favour, if the government gets this right, of those technologies taking off.
So, Justin, that is the theoretical case for what needs to happen, but it will need buy-in from newscasters and everyone else in the country listening and thinking about this. These are big changes.
These are big changes, and at the moment, according to the CCC's estimates, only 60,000 of us are putting in these heat pumps every year. But I'll tell you something really interesting. We've discovered that if I put heat pump in the headline on a BBC Online article, it does incredibly well, which is telling us, well, it may be telling us all sorts of things, but it's telling us there's certainly a hell of a lot of interest.
Donald Trump does well, doesn't mean people like him.
No, true. Yeah, but like we did a story today and it's already had 1 million hits, which is quite good. And heat pump stories typically do much better than other stories. And I think that could suggest, certainly it suggests curiosity, doesn't it? It may suggest people are triggered by it. Don't talk to me about heat pumps. But certainly people are reading the articles and are interested. But let's just go through the figures that are buried in, they're not buried, they're in there.
Buried.
But they're not buried.
They're in there.
It's a journalistic term, Emma. Let's dig out, let's excavate the details that Emma's put in her report. She says 60,000 at the moment. She wants that to be 450,000 by 2030. So within 5 years, 500,000 of us every year putting in a heat pump, and then 1.5 million by 2035. Now, I would suggest that those are ambitious figures. You talk about, she says the centre of all of this is electrifying Britain, and electrifying Britain means low carbon energy is used to power much more of the activities that we all are involved with in our lives. But we're not going to get that cheap power within 5 years, or it seems unlikely we will, given, the current kind of constraints on the government. So that does seem quite optimistic to me.
Emma?
Yeah, I mean, Justin's not wrong that what we're asking government to do is ambitious. And again, I suppose the point of the Climate Change Committee is to stand back a bit from politics and say the exam question is, what is the cheapest way of achieving the low carbon economy over the medium to long term, and what is a plausible pathway, and can you see a way for us to do it? And the answer to all those is like, yes, we can. It is achievable. These technology rollouts are plausible on the basis of like previous technology rollouts, but also what other countries have done. The critical thing that other countries had is their electricity price gas price ratio, so the cost of electricity and the cost of gas was a 3-to-1 ratio or thereabouts. Ours is bigger than that. If the government takes action to close that, we've seen it happen in other economies, so there's no reason that it can't happen here.
But I guess,
yeah, and government can make that choice. Just on why
well, you say the government can make the choice to make electricity cheaper. I mean, that's a bit like, motherhood and apple pie, isn't it? We'd all like cheap electricity. It isn't that easy. And in your report, you're saying you aren't actually giving recommendations on how to lower the price of electricity, apart from saying that some of the environmental and social charges that are imposed on our electricity bills are historic kind of over time, that those are taken off and put somewhere else. You don't say where that should be. So you could be on gas, could be on general taxation. So it's not like you haven't created a pathway to the cheap electricity that, frankly, drives almost everything in your report.
I think that's because it's out there, and I used to be the chief exec of the Energy Trade Body, which is the role I've come on to Newscast on previously, and for 5 years in that job, we were regularly meeting government and presenting ideas about how to move the policy costs of electricity. And it isn't actually that complicated compared to some of the things you see that they could also do on electricity, like wholesale market reform or separating the electricity and gas markets. We're talking about a choice to remove something off electricity bills in policy costs and stick it, as you say, into taxation and gas. Really smart people out there, my old organisation, lots of organisations have worked out how to do that. The Climate Change Committee doesn't get prescriptive on basically tax and spend because we're not elected officials. That's not our job. But we absolutely know there are ways you can do it. And I would contend it is straightforward. What I was going to say is what you have to make the case for to government in really challenging economic circumstances. Why should they put the effort into this thing? And what I tell you is in the report, there is a really good evidence base for the wider economy and for households of doing this, quite apart from climate change. People with heat pumps in their houses, people who are driving electric vehicles, save hundreds of pounds on their energy bills if the government makes this change on electricity prices compared to a world where we're still dependent on fossil fuels. And then go on.
I'm so sorry, Emma. I have a question about that. And I hear what you're saying and I understand the logic. But say, a newscaster listening to this is sitting at home or whatever in the car, electric car or not, thinking, oh, that sounds great. I can save money in the long term. How much are they going to have to shell out initially?
Yeah, and that's in the report too. So as Justin says, the other thing that's in the report is for electric vehicles, we think that they're going to be cheaper than internal combustion engine vehicles before too long. So people will make that choice and then they save money on fuel. And the estimate there is by 2050, a household with an electric vehicle will save about £700 on their driving costs relative to internal combustion engine vehicle.
But you know what I'm getting at.
On heat pumps, what we say in the report is, I was going to say, we don't see that change happening for heat pumps in the same way. What we do see is households saving the money once they have the technology. And again, in the report, we say if government is going to spend money on this transition, this is where people will need help. And we've modelled what that looks like in different households. I won't do all of them now, but you can see for high-income households, low-income households, high levels of insulation, low levels of insulation. And all of the information is there for government to make decisions about how they might target that support. And I think the benefits of that are very clear for people on their bills at a time when we don't really have many other options for reducing bills because those bills are high because of gas and the high price of gas. So if you're government thinking about national defence spending, economic security, volatile geopolitics, the energy crisis we just went through because of Russia invading Ukraine, I would seriously be thinking about this infrastructure as a national security imperative, like quite removed from climate change.
And that, Justin, is really a challenge to government because we haven't got into the exact numbers, but it's thousands of pounds to put a heat pump in. Thousands and thousands of pounds at a time.
It's more expensive even after the grant that the government currently has for most people. So there's a £7,500 grant for if you want to put a heat pump in. Even then, it tends to be more expensive, the installation for a heat pump. So this is, but I mean, to be fair, the report does acknowledge that there's this cost barrier, this purchase cost barrier.
That's a question for government then. Are individual consumers going to see the light, as it were, if that's the position you take? I'm putting, that's a pejorative term, but are they going to see the light and think, well, yes, I just need to suck it up and spend these thousands and thousands of pounds, assuming that people can get that money in a time of economic difficulties? Or does the government need to do more to help them?
Well, to be fair, the Climate Change Committee is talking about this and saying there probably does need help for the government, certainly for some sectors. But, I think Emma's point is if you can drive down the energy costs, it becomes much, much cheaper in the long run and therefore becomes a more kind of tempting offer, if you like, for people. Although I have to say, I think the anxiety about heat pump installation goes beyond just the cost. People are anxious about the way it heats your home. I mean, heat pumps produce lower temperature water typically, and therefore, you need to run your heat pump in a different way from your boiler. You can't just bang it on when you come in and expect the house to warm up. You need to kind of plan the heating a bit more and have the heat pump, sounds a bit counterintuitive, but you run the heat pump more than you would a boiler.
We're talked a lot about consumers here, but there's a whole other world of contribution to climate change, which we'll just come on to in a sec. But I wanted to ask you just one more specific question about your report, Emma, if I can. You are recommending, one recommendation is that sheep and cattle numbers fall by 27% by 2040. Wouldn't that devastate British farming?
No, and this is an area of work I'm really proud of in the report, if that sounds a bit geeky, because for the first time we've modelled changes in agriculture and changes in land use together. And what that means in essence is where we're removing livestock numbers from our kind of modelling on agriculture, we're often putting in new revenue streams for farmers in the form of growing biocrops, tree planting, peatland, and we've done lots of work with farmers directly about what that looks like. And it's not dissimilar to what the government is saying in their own land use framework, but we've done lots and lots of consultation. What we say in the report is that where you get to in our model is farmers potentially having a £1,000 to £1,500 net benefit from these changes per hectare. And what the government needs to do is make sure that farmers experience that, because we want them to be part of the solution to climate change. And they're experiencing climate change in their farms every day. So it's a really thoughtful way, I think, of approaching this. And I'm from, I live back in a rural community, and I completely recognise how important farming is culturally as well as in those landscapes. So you'll see all of that in the report.
Okay, so it's probably at this point that we should talk about the other big story of the day, Justin, and that is that BP, one of the world's biggest oil companies, has announced it's going to cut its investment in renewable energy and instead focus on increasing oil and gas production. And it's not the first oil company to do this. We've seen similar moves, I think, from ExxonMobil and from Shell.
Exxon never made the promises to
renewables. Yes, that's a good
But Shell
point.
did. Shell moved away from it. And it's extraordinary when you look at the returns. So the returns from 2020 from BP were 35%. Not bad, you would have thought. Over
on
5
renewables?
Years. No, on their whole business. So they're making 35% over 5 years. Shell's making more like, I can't remember exactly, it's about 87%. And then Exxon makes 165% or something. And the problem that BP... Look, if we're being understanding of BP, you'd say you've got these activist shareholders saying, hold on a second, look at Exxon. They're making 3-4 times the amount of money that you are. I want a bit of that. Why aren't you doing that? They have got many shareholders who are kind of restraining them and saying, look, stick to this. This is a kind of better long-term bet. This is save the climate. Let's do the right thing. Certainly that's what environmental groups are saying. But, there is a real dilemma for businesses. To what, and I suppose it boils down to this: to what extent do you prioritise short-term profits at the expense of, the long-term impact on the climate and arguably, and I think Emma might well have a view on this, arguably the long-term profitability of your business?
Yeah, and I suppose the other one is the Norwegian state oil company Equinor that's also making moves in these directions as well. Emma, what's your take? I mean, here you are saying, hey, consumers, you've got to pull yourselves together, pull your socks up, you've got to get green. And then why should newscasters spend tens of thousands of pounds on heat pumps and electric cars and changing their diet when oil companies are cutting their investment in renewables?
Well, I think because actually that's not what we say in the report. I think what we're saying is I hate to use the term pro-market, but it's pretty pro-market. And a lot of the advice on consumers isn't, hey, this is your problem to fix. The advice is, how can we make it so that the market provides you a cheaper technology so that you just have to buy it without thinking about it? Like, how can we get the automotive industry to make you a cheap electric vehicle?
Right, fair enough. Okay, I accept that was an unfair characterisation from your point of view of my characterisation of your report. But the key point stands, doesn't it? Which is you're seeing these big oil companies who've contributed arguably more than anyone else, albeit supplying us with oil and gas to global warming, saying, yeah, we don't really fancy doing that anymore.
And the answer, I think, the reason I started with, well, you know, that what we're saying is this is a really clear role for business here. A lot of the private capital that we're expecting to come forward in the carbon budgets across the economy, the spend that we're talking about, 65 to 90% of it is going to come from the private sector. And our value, I suppose, as the Climate Change Committee is not just offering government that long-term view, it's offering business that long-term view. And so unlike maybe an activist shareholder that's prioritizing short-term profit, we're making sure those businesses are still in business in 20 years' time when the energy transition is coming for them. And if you're an oil and gas major, you're already experiencing a drop in oil demand from China because they're getting electric vehicles. Consumers here, people are going to choose electric vehicles here because they're cheaper, regardless of climate change. And that's going to push down oil demand. So I learned I'm old today because I made a reference about Kodak and our job is to help businesses understand how not to be Kodak. And one of our younger staff members didn't know what Kodak was.
So you had your own Kodak moment, didn't you?
Yeah.
Kodak being
brand,
film photography.
Yeah,
being film photography, and then the company was
many years ago. We used to capture images.
Understand that digitalization was coming for them, entrenched in their existing business, thought they were too big to fail, failed to a degree now that my younger staff don't even know what that business was.
I mean, just to draw something else from the report that speaks to this question about the future of oil companies, if Emma's right and the long-term price of electricity falls and all this stuff becomes a lot cheaper, we will be buying, and it's already happening in China, as Emma says, we'll be buying a lot less oil and gas, to the point where I was really interested. You picked up on something. I missed it in my first reading, actually. They picked up on something. They said towards the end, we'll expect the transition to electric vehicles to happen much more rapidly. Why? Well, think about it, right? If half the fleet is electric, we're not going to need petrol stations anymore. And if petrol stations start closing down, which logically you'd expect that's what the market would do, would drive them out of business. If they aren't there, it's going to be harder to fill up our cars with petrol and diesel, which becomes another really powerful reason to switch to electricity. So there will come a point where, there'll be a tipping point where overwhelmingly the right decision, the best choice for most of us will be electric vehicles, and maybe in the future even heat pumps as well.
Right, but this is my final question, and quite quickly if we can, which is, in the meantime though, right now, is there not another tipping point, a shift away that exemplified here by what the oil majors are doing? And is that not to do with a change in political mood with Donald Trump back in the White House and so on? Nope. Justin first.
I think the whole drill baby drill agenda has created, if you like, cover. So before this new administration in America, there was a kind of consensus among certainly developing nations that tackling climate change was important, and it made it kind of, reputationally difficult for oil companies to make the kind of decisions that BP's making. This gives them cover to make these choices, and I suspect BP won't be the only company that uses that cover to change its policies in the short term.
Emma, are you concerned about that there's a shift in the wrong direction with this, as Justin calls it, drill baby drill agenda?
I think, just putting my old job hat on, the energy transition is fairly unstoppable. And so as Ian Cheshire, who's the ex-CEO of B&Q and Kingfisher Group, said on the radio this morning that although there's a lot of noise around this, businesses aren't really changing their investment strategies downstream from the oil and gas majors because the economics are clear. And then the other thing I'd say is, in every poll I've ever seen, the British public think that the environment and climate change is really important. It's always a top 5 issue. It moves up and down depending on the cost of living, which is understandable. But the good news about that is there is so much in the report today that says investing in these technologies saves the economy money in the long run, and it will help you with things like your energy bills and the cost of living. So regardless of what politicians think about net zero, I think most of them care about the economy. And I'm hoping, therefore, that, whatever the rhetoric, action continues.
Well, it's very good to hear from you with this particular hat on, virtual hat. Emma, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Justin, good to talk to you as always. Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.